So thank you very much for this kind invitation, and my apologies that I cannot be there. I had an important meeting yesterday, which did not bring me in the position to really come over to England and join you. So my apologies for that. Before I let's see, well, it works good. So before I go into the details, let me acknowledge people who really contributed a lot to the project. And you can see that, as a matter of fact, there are two projects. There is one focusing on propane, and then there is the other one, the big one on the oxidative dehydrogenation of ethane to ethylene. And all these people really contributed a lot, and without them, it would not have been possible to really come to this development, which I will show to you. And of course, there are also money from the Bavarian state and from the European Union, which helped in getting this done. Yeah. Cannot? No, I can. Good. So I will give you a little background, motivation, what's behind this work. Then I will, of course, show you the research on the arcane oxidation reactions. And in the end, I will conclude and give a summary. Now, yeah, you might know there is an increasing demand in the olefins, and this will continue to grow. Here on the left side, you can see that it is continuing. The ethylene demand, there will be no stopping, and the same holds true for propylene. And currently, most of this is produced via steam crackers or fluidized cracking, and there is a little propylene, ethylene, which ethylene is still on the development phase, let's say, but for propylene you have some on-demand, tiny amount of on-demand propylene, which is also being developed. Now, with respect to other molecules that are made out of these olefins, you have acetic acid and acrylic acid, and both demands are also increasing worldwide with remarkable growth rates of up to 10% per year. Now, is dehydrogenation of alkanes, is this really a sustainable technology? Well, these reactions are typically highly endothermic. You have equilibrium limited reactions that tells you that you need low pressures and high temperatures, and they become more and more favorable as the chain length becomes longer. So especially for the short ones, C2, C3, you have to go to really high temperatures, and for ethane, you would not even reach the full equilibrium, the full conversion levels. So this tells you that this is not really sustainable. The carbon footprint, you can imagine, is not very nice. And so you need another methods that you can use to generate these molecules. And the question, of course, is the oxidative dehydrogenation or a partial oxidation of such alkanes, are these alternatives? Now, which performance targets do you have to meet when you go for such a development? And this is taken from a paper from Cavani, and you can see the performances of all different catalysts that have been published in the literature. And here in green, that is the target region. This is the performance of a typical cracker. So you have conversion levels above 50% with very high selectivities, and so you have to reach that. Similarly, if you want to oxidize alkane propane into acrylic acid, there is a trade-off, or there's a break-even point of at least 65% acrylic acid that you need to reach in order to be commercial. And this is a plot of data that Robert Schlögl collected from the Fritz Haber Institute, and you can see published best conversion levels, and they are about 10% or so below the break-even point. So it's quite a challenging task, and your catalyst system has to fulfill it. Now, what does the patent landscape tell you? You can see that this is a huge number of patents have been published. More than 1,200 patents are around. So this is certainly an excellent knowledge basis, which is already developed. The IP generation somehow peaked in the early 2000 years and then is declining since then. So it tells you that there was quite some interest in industry, but obviously it never really materializes. And maybe that is because of the high levels that the catalysts need to reach, or maybe because of other things, I don't know. But an important factor is that the fundamental IP developed by Mitsubishi expired in 2007. So from there on, you were allowed to use the fundamental mixed metal oxide that has been also published for these two reactions. So where are the milestone developments in this respect? So it started quite early in the late 70s with Thorsteinsson. He worked on this kind of mixed metal oxide catalyst and reached already selectivities of up to 70%. So already quite nice. And then they said Mitsubishi patent in 87. Mitsubishi then a couple years later published a patent on the ethylene oxidative dehydrogenation with a little higher yield compared to Thorsteinsson. In 2000, BASF published a patent where they were able to, for the first time, make a phase pure M1. So that's the abbreviation name for this type of material by dissolving spectator phases. And Lopez Nieto, a couple of years later, proved that exactly this M1 phase is decisive for the oxidative dehydrogenation. And Asahi, again, 2 years later, announced that they would build a production plant for acrylonitrile from propane, which is a very similar reaction as compared to the acrylic acid. So this is already a nice size. And in 13, so about 10 years ago, Ueda from Japan published a synthesis where he could make M1 in small yields, though, without the tellurium. And you will see that tellurium is kind of a problem for the story. Now, what is known about the active centers? There is a famous paper in the early 2000 years by Bob Craselli, and he envisioned that this special structure here would be the active center for the activation of alkanes. Few years later, the Fritz Haber group came up with another suggestion where this phase of the crystals would contain the active center. So you should know this is the basal plane, which is not very abundant in this type of catalysts, and that would be lateral phases, much more abundant. So, so these two suggestions are around, so people sort of know or have an understanding what could be active and selective for these materials. And so the question arises, of course, why hasn't this class of mixed metal oxides not yet been commercial at really large scales? So, as we've seen, phase purity is a certain point. So it is not very easy to make these materials in high quality, high purity at large scales. So you always have to fight against spectator phases, which can destroy your catalytic selectivity. Then you have a certain broad compositional space that needs to be optimized for your reactions. And because different groups not necessarily take the same road to these materials, they might have slightly different catalysts. and therefore the catalytic performances reported could be not really consistent, and this of course leads to an inconsistent situation in the literature. And then finally, catalyst lifetime issues need to be addressed if you want to be commercial. And catalyst lifetime is something that you need to guarantee to potential customers at least for 2 to 3 years in order to really be successful. So you need to find the optimum elemental composition. You need to have the right surface termination in order to optimize and maximize your active centers. You need to nanostructure your M1 phase, so you have to guarantee that your crystals are faceted, are small enough in order to provide high enough surface area. And importantly, the optimum synthesis is maybe not really known until now. So there are different synthesis routes, as I already said, reported in literature. So the very early one of Mitsubishi, they combined solutions of soluble compounds and spray dried it to a powder, and then did a high temperature calcination on nitrogen, which then gave these said phase mixtures. And then I already said that BASF was able to dissolve the spectator phases and reach phase pure M1. Couple of years later, the Fritz Haber group around Robert Schlögl, they were the first one using hydrothermal synthesis to really, in one step, have a high purity M1 phase. But the synthesis relied again on soluble compounds. And with these soluble compounds, you do have a certain problem. First of all, telluric acid is not available on large scales. The synthesis is quite dangerous with boiling H2O2. So you cannot base your industrial synthesis on telluric acid. You need to do something else. And vanadiol sulfate is also a rather expensive chemical. So for an industrial synthesis, you would like to avoid these two compounds. Now let's look how Clariant started this project. So we started around 2007, and you may remember this is when the original patent of Mitsubishi ran out. We started the work and identified this class of catalysts as a platform. So by fine-tuning the elemental compositions, our idea was that we were able to fine-tune the catalyst to certain reactions. So this is the project which ran on the propane oxidation. This was a project together with the TU Munich and other partners in the ACENET network on the ethylene, oxidative dehydrogenation. And afterwards, we continued this work together with TUM and Linde in order to scale up the catalyst to large scales and to be able to provide Linde enough catalytic material for their process. So in the next couple of slides, I would like to give you some details about the first project on acrylic acid. So that's the project structure that we had. We had a group working. This was a startup company on data mining. They did data mining and predictive modeling. We had the group in the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, which did high throughput synthesis and testing. Then we had the group of Robert Schlögl in our team, which focused on the synthesis and process conditions, and of course the characterization of these materials. At Clariant, we worked on pilot scaling and synthesis and the forming of the catalyst, which is very important, of course. Yeah, you need to have a shaped catalyst in the end. And scientific design did process design studies for the acrylic acid reaction. So one of the first goals, of course, was to identify a stable compositional phase regime, which is prerequisite for high throughput optimization. So if you do not know in which boundaries your material, your envisioned M1 phase is stable, you would always end up with phase mixtures, and then you would compare apples with peas. And so that's why it was very important. And the group at the Fritz-Haber Institute focused on this first. And this is the compositional window which was targeted. Important to mention here, this is the classical synthesis method starting from soluble compounds, which was used for this study. The next important goal, of course, was to have a basic understanding for a process scheme of a propane to acrylic acid plant. And this is what our colleagues at Scientific Design did. They came up with this process scheme where you would have a recycle of unused propane, and so that is what they suggested as an industrial process. And we took this information and fed this information into our high throughput optimization strategy. And this is maybe something special. We did not simply optimize for acrylic acid yield. So we had a much more complicated objective function, which also included the propane conversion, which included steam, because steam, high pressure steam especially, is a highly valuable product in a factory, in a plant. And so this was the objective function which was used for the optimization using artificial neural networks and experimental and theoretical screening. Important to mention here, so the people at this data mining company, they trained more than 100 differently made artificial neural nets. Then they took the 100 best ones and made linear combinations out of them. And again, the best linear combination of these 100 artificial neural networks were then used for prediction. So this is really high-end mathematics. And you will see this led very fast to results. And this is how the high throughput testing was done. And for this, we already developed the first new synthesis method, relying here on solid compounds. So molybdenum trioxide and vanadium pentoxide instead of the expensive vanadyl sulfate is used. We still had to use the telluric acid. So this was still in the recipe. And that's just as an example, this is how such a data mining is done. So for example, you have here, this is a 6-dimensional setup. It's called holographic because it's sort of overlying waves, concentration waves. So compound A would have these frequency, compound B would have these frequency, and compound C would just have a half wave in this plot. And on this side, you have a similar frequency, and you can switch, of course, you can switch between these frequencies, and then you can investigate quite easily by just looking at this surface, where are your prominent best hit areas, and the bright yellow spots are those where you have the highest performance, the highest acrylic acid yield, and then you can select the area around these best points for your next generation. Yeah. And so this is the first 5 generations that have been investigated. And you can see already with 3 generations, we were at 40% yield. And then we redesigned because it narrowed down already. So the diversity of the libraries became smaller. So we increased the experimental space to 8 dimensions in order to have, again, room for improvement. And with another 2 generations, we were at 60% yields. So, so this is extremely fast. And you can see these are just something about 250 catalysts or so that have been prepared and tested. So it's not a lot for high throughput. So quite fast. And then we had a couple of generations more, 7 to 10. And in these generations, we investigated promoters that further could enhance the performance. Now, an important outcome of this high throughput investigation was that there are actually 2 families of catalysts. So you have a high vanadium family and you have a low vanadium family. So both catalysts are similarly good if the other compounds are adjusted well. And we will see this high vanadium content family again later. So this is just what I wanted to mention. As I said before, it is very important to really have a good understanding of the elemental composition and how these different elements interact. Now, in the end of the propane project, we of course also tried to scale this up, and in order to do so, we used a special technology, which is pulsation calcination reactor. You have a standing, you generate a standing wave, a standing pressure wave in this resonance tube. Here is the burner. You spray your suspension of your precursor powder in water. You spray it into this burner, and then it is in this resonance tube with the standing pressure waves. There is the calcination happening, and crystal growth, particle growth, only happens where there is a high pressure zone. And so by adjusting the frequency and the rise of the pressure in this standing in this tube, in the standing wave tube, you can fine-tune the particle size and agglomerate size, which is important, of course, for catalytic action. And this powder then was very homogeneously coated onto a support. In this case, we used ceramic beads or rings using such coaters, and that was the scaled-up catalyst for pilot testing. Now I would like to jump to the second project. This is the EDHOX process, as Linde calls it, which stands for ethane dehydrogenation. And this, as I said, was first studied in the ACENET project by the Technical University of of Munich. And they, in the first step, could confirm the literature that the M1 phase, so this special crystalline phase, is important for the best performance, and it has to contain the maximum possible vanadium content. So this is the high vanadium content family that shows best performance for ethane activation. In the next step, we of course had to further work on the preparation route, and in this case, we now resorted to the cheapest large-scale starting materials that are available, and this is only oxides. So for this method here, which has been further improved, we only use the oxides that you can buy in large scales. So no vanadiol sulfate anymore, no telluric acid. It's only oxides. So that is a preparation route that is now also possible of large-scale industrial production equipment. You can see that if you fine-tune the calcination, you can increase the catalytic performance. And if you now fine-tune also the content, the tellurium, niobium content further, you can also improve your catalytic action. So with these two further developments, we came to a very active and selective catalyst that was interesting to Linde. The colleagues at the Technical University, of course, investigated this material in more detail, and they saw that this new preparation route starting from the oxides led to a material that is very corrugated. So you make a lot of these facets where the group at the Fritz-Haber Institute proposed their active centers. And this is certainly part of the explanation why these new materials were so active and selective for the ethylene formation. In the next step, we at Clariant proved the long-term stability. And so this is a test that we did in a mini pilot reactor in my laboratory, where we ran the material for 2,000 hours without any loss in activity or selectivity. And with this results, we, together with Linde, started our work on the real scale up to large scales. So our first generation that we made unfortunately failed performance. It is the forming step which was critical, but was, of course, this was identified very, very soon. With a new recipe based on the oxides only, we were then very successful with the forming. Only a couple of months later, we made the material, and the new composition, that means reduced tellurium and niobium content, was also very successfully formed a couple of months later. So this is how the catalyst looks like in the end. Now, how does the process scheme looks like that Linde is envisioning? Again, you feed ethane, oxygen, water to your reactor. This is a classical molten salt bath reactor. Standard equipment in industry, and then you have the purification section where you remove ethylene from ethane, you remove the CO2, and you feed back the unused ethane to your feed. So it's a feedback closed loop pilot plant that has been built at Linde and that is used to develop and fine-tune the process. Here you can see some performance data. So compared to the previous Mitsubishi report in the patent, and you could see that already our first generation, which still resorted to the soluble compounds and had the wrong tellurium content, was already beating Mitsubishi. The second generation, only on the oxides, improved it further, and this third generation, which has been further fine-tuned, is really beating and reaching these very high selectivities that you need. Yeah, so with this, you really have something in hands that where you can rely on and you can base a process on. These are data from the pilot plant. So you can see that when you operate in ethane conversion levels around 50%, you can reach ethylene selectivities above 85%, together with acetic acid selectivities around, say, between 10 to 15%. And so both value products together give you a situation where such a process is really highly interesting. how does this new technology then compares to steam cracking? This is the benchmark. Of course, steam crackers are operated worldwide and huge equipments, and so you have to beat steam crackers. And so compared to such a investment, this new process would beat in terms of return on investment, because it's much cheaper equipment, and so 25% less or increase in the initial rate of return you would reach with this new technology. And I'm on. Now, how does it look like when you compare the carbon footprint? And of course, yeah, if you have a reaction which is endothermic, where you do not have to heat to extremely high temperatures, the reaction runs at around 300 degrees Celsius, 320, 30 degrees Celsius. It's exothermic, so as soon as it has been started up, it is self-sustaining. You don't need to heat it anymore. So you have a dramatic reduction in the CO2 emissions by 60% compared to a steam cracker. And if you further, for example, if you use renewable electrical energy for equipments like pumps, etc., you would be able to further reduce it, your CO2 footprint, and this makes it extremely interesting. Yeah. So, and with this, of course, we really generated a lot of interest in the market because of these two features here. So, what is now missing for the final commercialization? We have done the sustainability screening. This is required by our Clariant Code of Conduct. So we, as I just showed you, had a very positive impact on the energy savings, on the CO2 footprint. So this is the positive side. On the minus side, we do have two compounds, vanadium, molybdenum, which are suspected to be cancerogenic, but there is no substitution possible. So you have to work with these materials, and that would be a minus. REACH registration, which is required in Europe, has been done. So all the toxicological tests are done and completed. We have defined a production site. The recipe transfer to operation, according to our handbook, is ongoing. And we work on the product control plan with our QC/QA department. So this is work that is just currently ongoing. So let me conclude. I hope I could show you that such an industrial development is a long, winding road that you have to go. You have to explore a lot of different side paths in order to in the end be successful. And without the propane project, the ethane project would not have been possible. So both things belong together. You also have to look into side reactions in order to really understand the system on which you're working. And so it is it's very important to keep the eyes open to all different aspects. So I hope that I could show you that the oxidative dehydrogenation of ethane is a very interesting technology, especially Linde has now this process out for licensing, so it is available. We have developed a new production route resorting to cheap, large-scale raw materials. That was a mandatory requirement. Without that, Clariant would not have gone down this road. We could optimize the mixed metal oxide composition, and we could optimize and fine-tune the process together with the catalyst for maximum performance. These are standard equipment, so it's very cheap. The catalyst shape and the activity profile along the catalytic reactor has been optimized by us for this process. And I showed you, we have very high selectivities to value products, ethylene and acetic acid. Since 2020, Linde is licensing this, and first commercial projects are in the early phase. For the propane selective oxidation, we identified promoter combinations for optimum acrylic acid output, and we could suggest a propane to acrylic acid process scheme, and this is still in the drawer. So, and then finally, I would like to thank you all for your kind attention, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are.
So thanks, Gerhard, for that lovely sort of journey through a commercial process and bringing that to fruition. Do we have some questions? Yes, at the back.
Hello, Gerhard. It's Graham Hutchings here. So fascinating, really impressive talk. I've got a sort of off-beam question, I suppose. With ethane and propane, there's only one alkene that you can make. What happens? I mean, have you tested these with higher alkanes?
No.
Longer chain alkanes? Is there any interest in doing this with longer chain alkanes?
No, we have not tested it. Of course, it could be very, very interesting to look at this. Presumably, as you become also more and more reactive with the longer chain alkanes, you might end up in a situation where, like for the classical butane oxidation catalyst, where you cannot really stabilize the alkane or diene in your reaction system, and you would oxidize it further. So probably the same happens as for the classical VPO catalyst, where you have the alkene as an intermediate, but you cannot stabilize it anymore. But of course, it needs to be done. It's just speculation now, yes.
Thanks. I mean, butane, I think, is a special case because maleic anhydride is very stable. You know, it's not so easy to oxidize. So I just wonder, but would there be any interest in looking at, say, octane, something?
Sure.
Much
well, I think so. It is certainly interesting. We just did not do it. But okay. I would think it is very interesting. Yes, sure.
Well, I think you've done a fantastic job with ethane and propane. So.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got another question.
Hi, this is Keith Whiston from Coke Technology Solutions. One of the issues that you have with conventional dehydrogenation processes is acetylene formation. Mm-hmm. Are there any issues with acetylene formation using this catalyst system? Or?
No, there are very, very tiny amounts of acetylene formed, so sub ppm levels, and in our GARD catalyst or GARD reactor downstream of the main reactor, we have a system where we also have to remove the last few ppm of oxygen. Of course, you need to be completely oxygen free for the separation section, and this is where we also remove the acetylene, the few ppm acetylene.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions? If there are no further questions, then it just falls to me to thank Gerhard once again for his talk, as well as